We've reached John chapter 20, where Jesus has risen from the dead, and we're now at that point where he makes his very first appearance to Mary of Magdala. I'm reading from John 20, verse 10 to verse 18. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am returning to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." And Mary of Magdala went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that they had said these things to her. This is remarkable in the way in which this works. But let's try and think ourselves back into the scene of what has just taken place. It's just before dawn. A group of 4 women go to the tomb. They find the stone rolled back. The tomb is empty. They don't know what to do. They want to inform Peter and John. So Mary, probably the youngest of the group, volunteers or is given the task to run and to go and talk to Peter. So she runs through all the streets, back through the gate, and back to Peter. What do the other women do? They probably slowly follow behind, back to their own homes, back to their own place of lodging within the city. Mary tells Peter and John, and both Peter and John run back to the tomb. They must have run past the group of women. They must have run maybe through them, alongside them, as the women are making their way back in and not able to do the job which they'd set out to do. Peter and John arrive. John arrives first, hesitant to go in. Peter arrives second, runs straight in. They see that the strips of linen are still left behind, which means that the body has not been stolen or removed or taken to some other location. Rather, something has separated the body from its burial wrappings. The burial wrappings are no longer required. At that point, John believes. And as those two had run, presumably Mary now starts to make her way back to the tomb just to confirm what she's seen, to ponder over these things. And John and Peter, having established the situation, they leave. They follow the women back into the town, talking to themselves, wondering what this might mean. They probably pass Mary on the way as Mary goes back to the tomb. She arrives some time later, and she's there, it says, as the disciples go back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. Interesting. She's crying because she still believes that the body has been removed by some other people. Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, some other people. Maybe it was felt that this was just a temporary place and that they were going to put Jesus somewhere else. She didn't know. She wasn't probably involved in discussions with Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They were of different social standing. They probably didn't discuss anything at all. She had to guess what this was all about. Anyway, she goes back to the tomb, still crying, because she looks at the place where Jesus' body had been, and she sees what's said here to be two angels in white. Mark suggests it's a young man. There are some differences of opinion in terms of the different descriptions within the Gospels here. There's no reason why angels could not appear as a young man, but it says two of them here. But they ask her, "Woman, why are you crying?" Sometimes these questions are strange to our ears because it's pretty obvious, you might think, why you're crying. If you're angels, you would know full well why I'm crying. But it's almost like a Socratic technique which is being used. Even Jesus himself uses this kind of Socratic technique of drawing people out, asking a basic question to draw them out, to make them make a statement, to explain where they are. Never assume anything. The Socratic technique is very useful. Asking people questions before telling them answers is always a very useful technique in order to deal with other people. Why are you crying? And she says the same message. She hasn't made the leap yet. They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. That's what she told Peter and John. It's exactly the same message. She hasn't moved on. She hasn't seen what Peter and John have seen. What John has at that point understood, having seen the grave clothes, clearly they haven't taken Jesus away. At this she turns round and she sees Jesus standing there. Notice there was no reply from the two angels to that. At this she turns round and she saw Jesus standing there. Why she turns round, possibly, is because she heard something behind her. Heard a sound. And she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. Now, this has been a perplexing passage for some time. Why? Why would we ask, would she not recognize Jesus? If she saw Jesus again, someone who she knew full well, why did she not recognize him? Many kinds of explanations have been given for that. The idea that maybe Jesus looked different, maybe the resurrected body has a different quality to it, maybe there's something which has been altering the Jesus image. Even been speculated maybe that there's a substitute person who was taking the place of Jesus, who didn't quite look like him but almost did. All kinds of speculations have abounded on this. I tend to think that the explanation is very much simpler. And it's one which comes to you if you can think yourself into that situation. What's the time? The time is just after 6 a.m. It's only just light. There's a kind of a haziness maybe about it, and it's not a perfect bright sunshine or light at all. Her eyes have been peering into the darkness and the gloom of a tomb which she's not got into, and has been accustomed to the darkness there. Her whole focus is on the tomb. She hears a sound behind her. She turns around briefly and sees someone, but she spends very little time looking at that person. And if she did look at him, there wouldn't be much in that half light to see. May even been the light was behind him. We don't know the circumstances. But if you can imagine an emotional woman crying, in tears, continually looking at the tomb, because that's the focus of her attention, continually searching for any understanding of Jesus and where he might be, and almost half engaging in conversation with this other person. No time is she expecting Jesus Christ to appear. Her whole focus is therefore on the tomb itself. I can imagine, though it's a pure speculation, that she's mostly looking at the tomb while speaking to the gardener, who she thinks is a gardener. So I don't think she had much attention on the person who'd come along. She didn't pay great attention in looking at him in detail. She didn't examine him. She was more focused on tears in her eyes, constantly looking into the tomb to see some clue as to where Jesus might have gone. Overwhelmed by grief and emotion. It's hardly surprising in those circumstances that she didn't pay much attention to the man who was behind her. And it's hardly surprising that she didn't recognize him, therefore, as being Jesus, when that would be the very last person she would expect to see. We often only see the things that we expect to see. And she certainly didn't expect to see Jesus. The body had been taken as far as she was concerned. The repeated words come from Jesus himself. Woman, he says, why are you crying, and who is it that you're looking for? Identical words to the angel. Why are you crying? Woman, why are you crying? Term woman indicates some distance. It's how you would address a stranger. And that would echo and reinforce the idea that this is someone she didn't know. Thinking he was the gardener, and probably, as I say, not paying much attention to him, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where that you have put him, and I will get him. Just in passing, thinking that he was the gardener indicates that at least we can dismiss any ideas that Jesus didn't have some clear human form. Clearly he did, otherwise he couldn't have been mistaken for a gardener. He looked very much as an ordinary human being. But she didn't recognize him, I think, because she didn't pay hardly any attention to him, with her mind focused on the tomb and probably half watching the tomb still while talking to him. Tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. In other words, I want to be reunited with my Lord. I want to provide that final service. I want to see him again. I want to be with him even though he is dead. The pain and agony in that woman, someone who has been torn away from you, who you love very deeply and are concerned about, is palpable in this emotion here. It cuts through any answer about, woman, why are you crying? And it says here that Jesus said to her, Mary. Actually, the indication here is he didn't say the word Mary as in Greek or Hebrew, but he used the word Miriam, which would have been her familial name used by her family, her Aramaic name, the name that she was commonly known as and used at, and probably the name that Jesus used with respect to her, Miriam. Having spoken to her in her own language, she responds to him in recognition and cries out also in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. It's a special word for teacher, a special person, someone, not an ordinary rabbi, but someone who is highly esteemed. And at that point you have recognition. And here everything changes. Here everything becomes clear. Here hope is suddenly realized in a way which is impossible to have anticipated. She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabbi. How did she recognize him at that point? Because of the way in which he addressed her, because in which he used her familiar word, Miriam, because of the way in which he spoke to her in her own language, and because it's the way in which Jesus probably spoke to her 1,000 times before. At that point, she recognizes who is speaking to her. There is no doubt. If people think that there was a doubt because Jesus looked in a different kind of way, there's no doubt here. There is instant recognition. And the impulse must have been to rush forward to him. Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me." The original words could mean, and probably do mean, don't cling to me. Don't try to hold, maintain your relationship with me, because I am going. And although you think you have me back, I am back for only a short while. Don't cling on to me. Learn to recognize that you need to live life without my presence here amongst you. Don't cling to me or hold on to me. Why? Because I have not yet returned to the Father. In the Creed it says he descended to the dead. In the old Creed he descended into hell, and on the third day he rose again from the dead. That's an indication here in this passage that he hadn't, when he died, gone to heaven, but rather descended to the dead, whatever that means. Those are areas we know very little about, but what we can say is that Jesus had not yet returned to his Father, but the implication clearly was that I will be returning to the Father. Echoes again of that key passage in John's Gospel from the very start, which is the whole Gospel is an explanation of. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus came from God as he'd been there in the beginning, and now he was going to return to God. He had not yet returned to God, but he was going to return to God. And I've not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers. Now that's interesting. Brothers is a new term. I call you brothers, I think is what he said earlier on in the Gospel. I call you my friends is something he said earlier on in the Gospel. The fact that I go to my Father and to your Father means the relationship between us is that of brother, sister. It's no longer master and servant. That was echoed earlier on. Go to my brothers. He's not talking here about his earthly brothers of James and Jude. He's talking about the disciples. How do we know that? Because at the end we see that Mary of Magdalene went to the disciples with this news. The disciples are those who Jesus is speaking of when he says, go to my brothers and tell them I am returning to my Father and to your Father and to my God and to your God. Something has shifted. Something cataclysmic has moved, and Jesus has changed from death to life, and the relationship has shifted from master and servants to now friends and brothers, members of the same family. My God and your God, my Father and your Father. So she went. She left him, probably in great reluctance, but in great astonishment, great wonder, great joy, I would say too, as a hope, unexpected but powerfully realized in this encounter in the garden. Mary of Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." They were bemused by this. We'll see that later on. "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Later on, if they had difficulty believing that or worrying about why he appeared to her first, it's because she was there in the right place at the right time, I would say. Not because she was singled out for some special measure, but she happened to be at the place where Jesus was. But Jesus is intending to meet up with them later that day, that evening, which we'll see in the next passage.